Are the rules of capitalism as outdated as the belief that the world is flat? With me now is Eve Poole, author of Capitalism's Toxic Assumptions, Redefining Next Generation Economics, who questions our philosophy of business as usual. Well, Eve, how would you define the current state of capitalism?
Capitalism itself is a fairly amoral system. I think it is just supply and demand meeting in the middle. So what's happening at the moment is that the people who are able to put more messages into the market because they're richer and have more spending power are shaping the market to meet their needs, and that means a lot of people are being left out.
Well, you say that the market is governed by rules that are well past their sell-by date. What are we looking at exactly?
Well, I think they made absolute sense in Edinburgh in the 18th century when Adam Smith was cooking them up. But I think like a lot of things that we believed in the 18th century, they don't really work anymore. Competition is the idea that really all you need to do to make the market work is to make sure that people can compete with each other. And that works, I think, to an extent, but it ignores the benefits you can get from cooperation, and it's also quite a sexist idea. The second one is all about the invisible hand. And the idea about the invisible hand is that if you just leave the market to do its own thing, everything will somehow magically become good. I think if you do leave the market to its own devices, the rich and the powerful will tend to skew it to suit them.
So you question commerce and competition in commerce, and you say it's sexist. That sounds a little far-fetched. What do you mean by that?
In and of itself, it's not necessarily sexist, but it's sort of upheld by a sexist regime, if I can put it like that. And it's because the biology that underlies flight or fight response is really a male biology. So I think the idea is that if you feel under threat of any kind, or you feel that you might lose in a situation, if you're male, the body chemistry rewards you for that sort of situation. You tend to feel quite powerful and quite good about it. You tend to perform quite well. When they did some studies into where the fight or flight research had come from, they noticed that it was actually done on males. It was originally male rats and then male people, because female samples were, a bit dodgy because of hormones and very unreliable, so they sort of counted them out. And when they went back and looked at it, what they discovered is that in women, rather than being testosterone that's produced in a kind of conflict situation, I guess, it's oxytocin, which is the love drug when you're breastfeeding, nurturing children, that kind of thing. And the researchers dubbed that a tend or befriend response, and they said that women under pressure are less likely to button up and play a kind of zero-sum competition with people. They're more likely to reach out and communicate. And as we know from the mathematics behind it, communication and sharing is actually a better outcome sometimes in a competitive environment than out-and-out competition.
Are you trying to say that women are less cutthroat?
We all know women who can be brilliantly cutthroat as well, as good as the next man. I think the point about it is that women have an instinct which is about sharing information, the biology would suggest. I imagine there have been years of conditioning, and we know certainly if you hang out with a load of testosterone it has an effect on you. But I would imagine that even if this is a suppressed biology, if we were to encourage it and have more women around who were allowed to be women, we might get better business outcomes.
So if women were running the financial industry, you think that it would be more profit-driven, or do you think it would be less so? How do you think it would look?
I think it'd be profit in a different way, because it wouldn't be so much about zero-sum game, I win, you lose. It would be about creating bigger pies, so more profit for everybody. I do think if you look particularly at what happened in the credit crunch, it was essentially the banks stopping talking to each other. They wouldn't lend money out overnight. We now know that there was rigging going on with the LIBOR, but at the time, what we knew, the credit crunch, was because they stopped talking to each other, which is exactly what chaps would do in a conflict situation, which is you just hoard the information you've got, you play your cards close to your chest, and you just hunker down. I have this notion that maybe if a load of women had been in charge, they might have gone down the gym together and said, crikey, we're having a bit of a nightmare, how are you getting on? And that communication would have allowed the banks to work together to sort this out. The government didn't have to.
So if it was called Lehman Sisters rather than Lehman Brothers, the world would be in a better place. Well, you've identified short-termism in regards to shareholders as a major problem. What's the alternative?
I think the thing about shareholder value is it's kind of nonsense. I mean, there's this nice idea that there's a bloke in socks who helped create the company, and we've got to keep him right and keep his pension, his old age. But with modern technology and modern trading, the average time for which a share is now held is about 11 seconds. So I don't really know who the shareholder is. It's kind of infinitesimally there and gone in a second. There's also a whole load of legal challenges that suggest that shareholders don't really own very much anyway. So it's a wee bit like having Santa Claus around to try and make the children behave, going on about the shareholder all the time. I think if we're looking at value in its wider sense, it's about stakeholder value, and that makes it longer term because you're including the community, the supply chain, and a whole load of other things in those calculations rather than just a very narrow financial measure.
Now, earlier you said that the market values or it looks after the strong and powerful, but isn't this surely just the natural order of things? Because in an ideal world, perhaps everyone would be equal, but in reality, they're not really, are they?
Certainly Adam Smith rather hoped that because people were generally moral, those who benefited from the system would, like many of his contemporaries, end up being huge benefactors. And, you know, we know about Carnegie and all these amazing people and Bill Gates today who use their wealth to help people who are less well off. I'm afraid we're just not really seeing that. We're not seeing that sort of trickle-down effect.
So you've come up with a revolutionary organisational framework. What are we looking at?
It's about some very small changes we can all make as workers, as employers, as leaders, as consumers, as investors. And really all I'm asking people to do is at the end of the month, have a look at your bank statement, look at what you've done economically that month, and if you don't like it, change it.
Well, I read in your book that you were suggesting that customers choose what they pay, that staff can suggest their own salaries, and then it's also performance management led by the payers. If that happened in reality, I know my experience through my company, I don't think it would be a very profitable business. Could this really work?
No, where it's been tried, it's actually worked quite well. There have been some very interesting experiments in pay what you like around new releases of albums and people setting their own salaries in some employee-owned companies. And I think, yes, you could be cynical and say you might well need to police that, but we just haven't really tried it enough to have the data to know. What we have tried is a system that assumes they're all recalcitrant, and if we're not kept an eye on, we'll skive and we'll ruin the company. And there seems to be a huge amount of evidence to suggest that if you treat people like interesting individuals who've got something to offer, they'll tend to respond much better.
But Eve, could this really work? Because looking at my salary, for example, if I could choose my own salary, I'd be looking at a lot more noughts. And how would this even work?
If you give employees all the information, they know that overpaying themselves will ultimately bankrupt the company and there'll be no more to become in the future. They also know that overpaying themselves around pensions and things wouldn't really be in their long-term interests. So what you find is that people get quite canny about what they will and will not ask for and what sacrifices they'll make. And really the situation we've got at the moment is that we do have a lot of senior people setting their own salaries through remuneration committees, and that's not really stood us in good stead at all.